Hi there, I'm David Harvey, and I'm here with John Andrews, and this is the Two Texts podcast. In this podcast, we're two friends in two different countries, here every 2 weeks, talking about two different texts from the Bible. This is our second season. It's about the miracles of Jesus. This is episode 17, and it's called John Chapter 9, Part 1. Well, John, we are into Chapter 9 of John's Gospel. So let's track what John's doing here. He's working through these signs, and we've looked at them, turning water into wine, healing people by a pool. He's healing a royal official's son. Then there was a couple of signs, the walking on water, the feeding the 5,000, which we've talked about earlier in this series, so we jumped over them. But these signs are really driving through right up till about chapter 11 of his Gospel, aren't they?
Yeah.
And we are now at chapter 9, which is a story that you and I are both very excited to talk about. I think that's fair to say, isn't it?
Yeah, very. It's a cracking story. Absolutely.
And I mean, this story's got everything: humor, irony. There's a healing in it. There's tension. There's an argument. There's everything's in this story.
It's very good. It is. It's a lot going on. Absolutely. It's fab.
It's such a good story that we're going to take the next 2 episodes to kind of talk through this, aren't we? So it's today and in 2 days' time we'll be finishing out this chapter.
So I'll kick off verse 1 of chapter 9. And it says this: as he, that's Jesus, went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," Jesus said, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spit on the ground. I have to say, I love the change of gear. I am the light of the world. After saying this, he spit on the ground. Do you know, I can hardly read that without laughing. I don't know if John meant that to be humorous, but it just feels humorous to me. Anyway, let's try and get back to
It's not how you'd expect. It's not how you'd expect the next sentence to go, is it?
No, it's not how you expect the light of the world to behave. Okay, right. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbours and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they asked. He replied, "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said.
And so let me pick up from verse 13. It says this: they brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now, the day in which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was, you can probably guess, was a Sabbath. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. "Oh, he put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "Well, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "Well, how can a sinner perform such signs?" So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "Well, he is a prophet." They still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see?" This is one of my all-time favorite bits of biblical response, John. So I'm laughing because I just love this. Verse 20, "We know he is our son," the parents answered, and we know he was born blind, but how he can see now or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who had already decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. And this is why his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." A second time, they summoned the man who had been blind. "Give glory to God by telling the truth," they said. "We know this man is a sinner." He replied, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." And then they asked him, "Well, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "Oh, I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" So they then hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Well, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out.
Incredible. Isn't that incredible?
Just some brilliant, brilliant literature right there.
Well, I'm sure that John's pencil or pen or whatever he was scribing on was wobbling about with some of that, with the sense of humor in the. I mean, it's incredibly serious. We absolutely understand. We're not minimizing this text, but it is also laced with humor and there is a gorgeous. I'm trying to work out the tone of the man who gets healed here. There is this sort of audacity in him. There's a boldness in him that he just speaks up, and he does talk like a disciple of Jesus, of course. And at this stage in our story, he's not, but he's just calling it as it is. It's like let me tell you what happened. Okay, let me tell you again what happened. Okay, let me explain how it happened. And then there is an audacity in his response that is just totally refreshing. And I think it's that audacity that seems to sort of cause the religious community to get extremely defensive around him and ultimately get a bit abusive and insulting towards him. But it's I love it. I can't help but read this and not smile. And then when you hear someone else read it, like you reading it there, I was literally giggling as I'm going through the story because I just think it's so cool.
And I think it's important to spot that the writers are doing this in a biblical text sometimes. Sometimes we only ever read biblical texts as if they're all deeply serious. And of course, they are deeply true, and the subject matter is very serious. But the humor of this, I think, is definitely in John's agenda, because he wants you to see the ridiculously of the interchange. The man's point is right, but I can see.
Yeah.
So why are we questioning whether this man's a good man or not? Because I was blind and now I'm not blind. So something profound has happened here. And so for me that's a really interesting sort of process that's going through that now, and we're going to see this more by the time we get to the next episode, but there's even a play going on by John at this point around, well, who actually can see and who can't see in this particular story. But yeah, there's so much sort of crammed into this text that is just leaning into John's agenda. Even you noticed it resurfacing there, this question, where is Jesus from? Right? Yeah. And of course, John told you that at the prologue. He's from God. The moment you have this privileged information that Jesus is from God, the whole way you read the story is different. Right? Yeah. Like, we're going to argue if he's a sinner. We're going to argue where he's from. Well, you, the reader, know from the very beginning he was from God. Even this allusion to, they say to the man, give glory to God and acknowledge the truth. Well, what did we have right back? We beheld his glory. He brought truth to us. It's all meshing beautifully, isn't it, John?
It is absolutely stunningly. And again, I think this is probably one of the most powerful, for me, link stories. I think if you're looking at, I know we're looking at all the signs and they will link in dramatic ways, but once you see the breadcrumbs line around here from this prologue idea, it's really hard to miss them in John chapter 9. They're everywhere for us, and I think it's a very powerful link story. We've just come out of John chapter 8, and I know there's a bit of controversy around the beginning of John 8 with the inclusion of the woman caught in the act of adultery, but of course it launches from there straight into I am the light of the world, and we get this incredible declaration of Jesus in John 8, that he's the light of the world, one of the great I am statements. And then, of course, out of this story, and almost seamlessly out of chapter 9 of John, he launches into this discourse where he describes himself as the good shepherd, as the gate for the sheep. So there's something really it feels like a very strong link story. It's not just one of the great signs for me. It feels like it's pulling a lot of big stories together and linking them through. And it feels like, I know in our Bible, John 9 follows John 8 and precedes John 10, but it does feel like they're glued. It feels like there's a real sense of connectedness with the big ideas that we're now unearthing in this beautiful, funny, tragic, humorous story of the man who was born blind. So it really is a magnificent story.
And even a subtle shift, perhaps, where John's format has been one where there's miracle and then discourse about the miracle. So here's the miracle. Let me now unpack that a little bit for you. Whereas when you do what you've just done there, John 8 seems to be the discourse, and now John 9 is the sort of miracle that unpacks the discourse. Jesus says, I am the light of the world, and then he meets a man in darkness, perhaps, and he repeats the language of light of the world. And then there's a question by the end of chapter 9, which we'll deal with this week in due course, but the question then at the end of chapter 9 being, well, who's in darkness and how do they find the light? So the whole thing is meshing together really quite powerfully, isn't it? And if you stretch even further back to the end of chapter 7, the question about Jesus' provenance is there again. Where is he from? Right? And of course, there's something really interesting happens at chapter 7 wherein the religious leaders raise this complaint against Jesus. They say he cannot be the Messiah. In fact, he can't even be a prophet, they say, because no prophet ever came from Galilee. And the irony is, the religious leaders accuse the people for being misguided. They say, essentially, you kind of slow people. You don't even know the scriptures. A prophet cannot come from Galilee, which, of course, is, again, brilliant Johannine irony, because he assumes, I think, that you, the reader, know this, because he assumes that you've done your Old Testament homework. But, of course, Jonah is from Galilee, right?
He is.
So there's this deep irony that John's pushing, that these religious leaders have even got themselves a little bit detached from Scripture, and therefore perhaps they're not as trustworthy on these matters as you might think.
And I think, too, there is a little hint, and I think this comes across in John 9 as well. I think once you start to get desperately defensive over a position, or you become threatened, or you feel insecure on that position, I think that's when you tend to come out swinging. And when you come out swinging, you tend to make mistakes. So you see it even here in the John 9 story, that actually the man who is born blind is starting to sort of get the upper hand in the theological conversation. He's actually, that little mini discourse where he explains the fact that, well, don't we know that God doesn't hear the prayer of a sinner, and a man couldn't do this unless he was a good man? And he's actually putting this together. He's weirdly and wonderfully using their own theological premise to push back on them, ideas that they would And of course, how do they respond? They respond by insulting him. They go back to his original state, which was, well, you were born blind. That means you're dirty, filthy sinner. You were steeped in sin. I mean, it's a really nasty, barbed criticism, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's an undoubted, if you hear the echo of the disciples saying, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? That is echoed in the religious leaders who said you were steeped in sin. And I think they're throwing a terrible insult at him because their own position is being threatened. And John seems to show this. It feels to me like more than the gospel writers, where at a theological level, Jesus is absolutely getting under their skin. And I think he's rattling the cage of their world much more. And so you're getting these sort of aggressive, sometimes nasty, sometimes even mistaken response to the situation that we're in. So there's a wee pattern developing there. I think you see it in John 7. I think it's also there in John 9. If you wanted to really push John 8 and the woman caught in the act of adultery, I think Jesus absolutely bamboozles them, because according to Moses, she dies, and yet without in any way pushing back against Moses, he manages to actually create an escape for the woman by exercising grace to her. So there's a sense in which this man is really getting under their skin. He's rattling their cage. He's disturbing their world. And they don't seem to be able to get sort of their hand or leverage on his theology around this. And it seems like the man who's now received the sight, it sort of makes it worse. He almost becomes a voice for Jesus himself in this context, which irritates them further.
And think about the patterns that John's creating then for us. I sometimes think about John as if he's almost setting up this whole gospel as a piece of pantomime. You remember those stage shows we used to go and see as children that were very, very slapstick, weren't they? And or even some of the old silent movies where when the bad guys came onto the scene, the music changed. So even without, and like I remember at Pantomime when we were kids, when the kind of the bad guy came onto the scene, he would quite constantly in the pantomime theater say things. But even as a little kid, you knew, you don't trust anything he says because it won't be true. So he would come on and tell you what he was doing. And sometimes as kids, you would shout out, no, you don't, that's not true. Because somehow the nature of the way the story was told, you knew that this character isn't trustworthy. So now think about what John's, and I don't like to use the term bad guys of the Pharisees, that's definitely not, but the religious leaders are set up by John as untrustworthy. And you really see that polarized here. And I think what John's doing for us is this constant play of aligning with Jesus, light of the world, will be a way of truth for you, and aligning yourself against the light of the world will always lead you into untruth. And so now you have this, and you see this, and bear in mind, this is the language of light of the world that's being expressed here, isn't it? That who sinned? And Jesus says, no one, right? This is not what this is about. But then later, as you've pointed out, unsurprisingly, the Pharisees are still held on to this idea that this man's situation is a result of sin, even though for you, the reader, this has been decisively ruled out at the start of the story. This is not about this. So you're seeing this continuing, in chapter 7. The Pharisees say, well, these people don't know the law. They don't know the scriptures. But again, following Jesus will give you an illumination of understanding from the scriptures that might even surpass that of the religious elites. It's really interesting storytelling if we let it do its job, isn't it, John?
It is, and it's a very helpful way to understand that John is positioning that as the conversation of grace and truth proceeding in the ministry of Jesus throughout this gospel, and not as an attack on one particular group or one particular idea, but simply setting up, here's what the light looks like, here's what the truth looks like, and therefore it exposes, as light always does, it exposes darkness, and truth always exposes error. And that's what's happening here. And it is unfortunate to an onlooker because it looks like John's being sort of aggressively anti-Jewish, which of course John was dyed in the wool good Jewish man. He's not in any way being anti-Jewish in the sort of anti-Semitic sense, but he's setting up truth and light as the standard in Jesus, and therefore creating the contrast away from that. And the contrast in John's gospel almost invariably falls to the religious community, who themselves see themselves more and more trapped by their own inability to grasp. I mean, the fact in our story here, the parents are afraid to speak because there's clearly already some sort of injunction out there. And the injunction is anyone who acknowledges Jesus as the Christ going to be put out of the synagogue. Now, the fact that John includes that means it's already out there. So Jesus has made such an impact in Jerusalem through the Johannine text that actually there's this, wanted poster, if you like, on the wall that's saying anyone who identifies with Jesus as the Christ is out. And of course, we get that sense, don't we, at the end of our story? It feels like the man has been put out, doesn't it? That's how. I mean, our story doesn't end where you finish reading, but it finished with this. Oh, and they put him out. So he himself gets put out, even though he is a bona fide, miraculous, we might want to argue, messianic sign of a man born blind, having his eyes opened, and his own words said, who's ever seen anything like this happen before? I mean, there's no record of a man born blind being healed, and not even in the biblical text. And he's going, come on, have a look at this. And their only response to that is to put him out. So you can see that there is this explosive confrontation building in the Gospel of John, and it feels much more intense to me. And please forgive me, you correct me if I'm reading that right. It feels much more intense in the Johannine text than it does even in the other Gospels, and it can be pretty edgy in the other Gospels too.
Well, because I think what John is doing is weaving in layer upon layer of story. And so this sort of stuff is being set up for quite a lot of, these conflicts aren't incidental in John. They're part of the way he's telling the narrative. And even the trajectories of the narrative. Now think about Nicodemus in John's gospel. What do we know about Nicodemus? He comes to Jesus. Pop quiz, when does he come to Jesus?
Indeed.
He comes at night, right?
Yeah.
So Nicodemus comes in the darkness to the light of the world. Okay, so think about that. So Nicodemus now becomes an archetype of what we should all be like. Come from darkness to the light of the world. So Nicodemus comes from the religious elite. So there isn't a strong anti-religious elite narrative the way it sometimes get read, because Nicodemus, the one kind of, hey, look at him, he's the one you should be following his model, he is actually from that group. So he comes as a follower of Jesus, and he comes from darkness to the light. Now, what's interesting is if you hold that in mind and you get to chapter 13, and Jesus is having this final meal with the disciples, and it becomes apparent in the meal that somebody has betrayed him. And Jesus, of course, we know that's Judas. They have this story about this, but then notice just this final comment, right? That Jesus says to Judas, what you're about to do it quickly. And then nobody else at the meal understands why Jesus is saying that. And then this verse 30 of John chapter 13, as soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out. And then he just drops in this line, and it was night. So now look at this trajectory, right? You've now got this trajectory of Nicodemus coming from darkness to the light of the world. You've got Judas going from the light of the world away, and guess what? It's night. It's the complete inverse trajectory. And one of my favorite little pieces of John, and this is like, you might, not everybody would agree with me on this, but I think this is the level you have to pay attention that John's going to nuance things. Jesus then goes out to a garden in John chapter 18. And all the way through, they're in this garden. And actually, if you think about it, you know it's probably still nighttime because it's the same evening that Judas went out and it was nighttime. But nothing is mentioned. And then in John chapter 18 and verse 3, Judas reappears in the story. And it says he brought soldiers with him, together with the kind of police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came. And what did they bring with them? Lanterns, torches, and weapons. But he mentions two different sources of light that they bring them. And at which point, I think the really observant reader notices, at no point has John mentioned that Jesus and his disciples have anything with which to see in the dark. Now, I think that John's doing that purposefully because they're with the light of the world. So when this other group come, they even need things to see with. And it's all part of this. And I think if you grasp that, you realize, whoa, this gospel is a work of art, of layering together theological difference, the journey towards truth, the journey towards light, and actually eventually this journey either towards or away from the light starts to change even how we perceive the kind of physical world that we're living in. I think it's stunning work theologically.
Phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. And I do love when the disciples say to Jesus, who sinned? And Jesus says, well, nobody has sinned here. And he says, this has happened so that the works of God might be manifest, may be seen, may be observed. And of course, I can't help to pick up your connections there, David. I can't help but feel that the creational motif, that actually the first thing created in the creative order spoken by God is light. Let there be light. And then out of the light, because of the light, we are able to see the manifest works of God. We're able to then, we can see the creation. We can see the animals. We can see. So everything that happens after the light gets made is possible because the light has made it possible. The light is the way, is the thing that makes the way for all these amazing creative works to be done. And so out of light comes all the glory of the creative order of those first magnificent 6 days of Genesis creation. I can't help but feel that as well here, David. It feels like even the fact that Jesus spits on the ground, makes mud. I'm feeling Genesis all over that. The man made out of the dust of the ground and the life of God coming into him. And it's like even as Jesus applies the mud to the man's eyes, this is a manifestation of his glory in this sort of creative motif. But it's all coming out of the light. He is the light. He's the one. In him was life. And that life was the light of men, John says in the prologue, isn't it? The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. And it's a direct echo of verse 5 in our story. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So, and that statement of I'm the light of the world precedes the miracle. So it's like the light is the link here right through. It's your beautiful nuance and how that light is seen in contrast to the darkness all the way through. And of course, here we're seeing literally in our story, the darkness of the man being dispelled by the light of the world in literally the creation of sight through this. And when you run all of that together, you go, wow, they are stunning links all the way through the Gospel of John and a beautiful little climactic moment in John 9 here.
And of course, these I am sayings, and you and me have both talked about how we need to circle back to the I am sayings in John's Gospel and spend a bit of time in another series talking about them. But I think I just want to mention, we've got the I am saying in chapter 8, I am the light of the world. My kind of highlight comment would be to remember that these statements in John's Gospel are, I think anyway, are Jesus saying, I am, as opposed to anything else being. So when Jesus says, I am the light of the world, he's essentially saying, I'm the light of the world, and therefore other things which you believe to be light of the world are perhaps not the light of the world that you think. I am the bread of life, other things that you're not. Now, and you have to tread carefully of this so that you're not accused of saying what you're not intending to say, but most of these things that Jesus says about himself, I am, are things which are held to be true of Torah, are things which are held to be true of the law. True. So this one's really interesting because I am the light of the world sounds like a sort of contrast to the language we encounter in Psalm 119, for example, the famous verse that a lot of people would probably know. Psalm 119, verse 105, your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light to my path. Now think about this. If this is what John's doing, which I'm of the opinion that he is, that Jesus is now the answer to all of these questions that we had. Who is the light to our path? Well, notice what the Psalm says. Your word, if you're reading the Psalms in Greek, it's the same word, this logos word. Your word is the light to my path. Your word is the lamp to my feet. Well, who is this word? Well, John's now come along right at the very start and said, oh, that's Jesus. Right? So there's a real sense of the ratcheting up of the pressure throughout this as to what is the right light of the world. And so I think there's some really interesting things to sort of engage with about here Jesus coming in and bringing this true light that was talked about that allows everyone to see. And then the sense of what they do see is how God works, which I feel like you're knitting together a really tight little piece between John chapter 9, verse 1 and 5. Because if Jesus is the light of the world, if he is the true word that brings light to our path, then this, in fact, is the answer to the question, well, who sinned? Well, actually, this whole story is not about sin. It's about revealing God and how God, notice it happened so the works of God might be displayed. So there's almost a sense that these first 5 verses are showing us this is how God works. I mean, that's a lot, John, but I mean, is that tracking for us?
It certainly tracks for me. It works for me. I do think that we get consumed with the sort of the mechanics question, who sinned, and of course there is a legitimacy around exploring why the disciples would think like that, and the sort of theological trajectory that produced a worldview that said, if you're good, you get blessed, and if you sin, you get judged. And there is sort of movement around that. But of course, that's not what Jesus is wanting to get into. He's not arguing for or against that. He's saying, actually, this is the opportunity into the light of the world can come. This is the opportunity into which God can manifest his works among us and into the brokenness. So for Jesus, the preoccupation is not around whose fault it is, but in bringing the manifestation of the glory of God and the solution to the situation that we're in, which of course is that complete redemptive idea that the Lord wants and has always been willing to step in to the brokenness of our world and bring that redemption, restoration, healing, and wholeness that only he can bring to our world, whether that be a created world or whether that be even a human in this context. So I do think there's, in those first few verses of our story, I think it's almost like a little mini prologue to the story. It's like it's an explanation of what you're about to see. And it's a powerful layup. It's a powerful setup to understanding the power of the sign we are about. And if our listeners can lean back into that this is one of the signs. So what is the sign? What is going on here? And what is being signed to, and how are we grasping it? And I think that those first 5 verses are really crucial to getting that in this story.
And I'm not sure we do grasp it, if I was being maybe too pointed for a podcast, John. But this question that the disciples ask, like, I think we still ask that question to this day, despite knowing this story. So, and perhaps you could unpack this a little more if if you wanted to. It seems the disciples are asking a question rooted in what we'd call Deuteronomic, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. That seems to be the impression you get from, if you were just to read Deuteronomy, you would get this sense that that's how it works. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Now, if you read the whole Old Testament, it challenges that notion entirely. Yeah. You get to the Proverbs, and it's. I remember somebody saying once that you get to the Proverbs, and the Proverbs tries to lean into that thought as well. This Deuteronomic principle: do good things, be wise, good things happen to you. And then you get books like Ecclesiastes, where Ecclesiastes seems to sort of pick at that a little bit and go, well, maybe life's not always quite as simple as we thought it was. And then you get the story of Job, right? Where it's like, here is a decidedly good person for whom a whole host of bad stuff happens. So, in my view, the Old Testament has raised big questions about this way of thinking, right? And then Jesus really raises these questions, and I think because of his rootedness in grace. So what are the works of God that are displayed? Well, one of the things that's being displayed here is that God doesn't work. Philosophers call it desert. God doesn't give people what they quote-unquote deserve. But so this question seems unfamiliar to us. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? But if we were to reword this question and ask, like the question about blame, who's to blame in this situation? I feel like we still struggle with that problem to this day, that we try and live out. You see a homeless person on the street, and I know often when I talk to people, there's this kind of narrative in our world which says, well, what did they do to end up there, right? Which is actually if you've ever seen somebody, quote unquote, down on their luck and wondered, well, I wonder what they did to end up there. It's the same question that the disciples asked Jesus here, isn't it?
Oh, and it's brutal, it's overly simplistic, and of course, it makes you feel good if life's good. So that, I mean, that's the killer, isn't it? So the people who tend to ask that question tend to be people who are on the better side of that equation. And so life's rocking for me, it's great. And therefore I could look at someone less fortunate myself and ask, I wonder what they did to deserve that. And I sometimes describe this as a sort of a Jobology theology. It's, you read the book of Job, 8 people speak. You've got God speaking, the adversary speaks, Job speaks, his wife speaks, and his 4 friends speak. And the only person you can really trust in the whole of that narrative speaking is the Lord. Every other voice, at very least, you've got to read carefully. And some of the statements of Job's friends are shocking. If we built our theological house on some of the things they said, I mean, we would be in catastrophic disaster. I was just reflecting on this. Eliphaz, it's one of the first statements of Job's friends to Job is from Eliphaz, and he says these words, "Consider now, who being innocent has ever perished?" What a question. He says, where were the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed, he says, those who plough evil and those who sow trouble reap it. At the breath of God they perish. At the blast of his anger, they are no more. Now, when you're sitting in a 5-star hotel and life's good, then actually that theology really is quite attractive. When you're sitting on the dung heap, scraping the pus out of your boils, having had everything taken from you, this is appalling. And of course, we know the backstory to Job, and that Job doesn't deserve any of this in the sort of righteous, unrighteous sense. It's funny, David, I was reading this morning my daily devotions in Luke's Gospel. Dr. Luke does a beautiful thing for Zechariah and Elizabeth. He describes Zechariah and Elizabeth, he describes their lineage, that they're both, he's from the priestly line, she's from the line of Aaron. He describes them both as upright people. When it comes to the law, he describes them as blameless. And then it goes on to say, but Elizabeth was barren. And there's a beautiful thing right at the end of Luke's Gospel when it talks about Elizabeth getting pregnant. Here's what she says. These are the words of Elizabeth now. Now remember, this is true record, not necessarily truth as God would teach it. But here's Elizabeth's version of the truth. She says, the Lord has taken away my disgrace. So note that here's a beautiful woman, loves the Lord, living upright, and yet because she's barren, she's viewed as disgraced. So I think that theology was absolutely prevalent in the world of Jesus. I think the gospel writers work very, very hard to push back on that theology. I think they're trying to qualify an understanding of that. And of course, if you are approaching all of that with grace, then actually there's no room for that sort of self-righteousness and smugness, which allows me to say, well, I'm not blind, therefore.
Yes.
He's blind, therefore. Well, I'm not homeless, therefore. He's homeless, therefore. And these sorts of simplistic, superficial, reactionary positions are not only deeply destructive for the individuals who hear them, but I think they are deeply subversive, because they lead us away from the grace of God. And ultimately, to use your analogy of darkness and light, I think these ideas lead us more to the darkness than to the light.
And as you said, these theologies were very prevalent in the time of Jesus, but I just believe they're also prevalent for us today.
Totally.
You only need to spend 5 minutes on Instagram and the language, or head into a self-help section of a bookstore or an online website. It's like, here's the 5 laws or the 7 steps or the 10 rules that if you do these things, and that earning do language comes in there. And I think, these ideas have to wrestle. What was it Jesus said? Blessed are the poor. Right? Blessed are the persecuted. So somehow our view of how the world works as followers of Jesus needs to make sense of blessed are the poor. Skye Jitani in one of his little books, he says Jesus obliterates our wicked tendency to judge others by their circumstances. And
very good.
And I think that's what we've got going on here. Well, who sinned? Well, Jesus says, well, what if it was no one? Right?
Yeah.
What if it was no one? And so there's some real deep work happening even for us today in John chapter 9. You thought you signed in just to listen to a healing of a man who was blind, and all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, this is talking to me in the 21st century.
Absolutely. And it must challenge our hearts that the focus, I suppose, can I say in my response, that the focus is not on the cause, but the focus is on the redemptive offer. But ultimately, it's even when Jesus speaks to the man, there's no conversation about his past. There's no conversation about anything that may have brought him to this position. He just brings a solution to the man's circumstance. And that's the essence of the gospel in Jesus Christ. Jesus is not obsessed with what brought you to this place. He is obsessed with getting the redemptive answer to you that will release you from the position that you are in and bring literally or metaphorically light into your darkness and bring deliverance. And I think in our darkest moments of religion, David, I think we're a bit too obsessed on cause. We're a bit too obsessed on the story. We're a bit too obsessed on how you came to be where you are. And I know there's validity in those conversations in the right place, but actually it's sort of, John 9 seems to say, it sort of doesn't matter how you got here. What matters is the light is here. The light is here, and the light can bring life into your brokenness, into your darkness, and into your death. And that's really the driving force of this beautiful sign, it seems to me.
Yeah, it's quite something, isn't it? And so then you get this little moment of Jesus making some mud. We've seen Jesus do this sort of thing before in the Gospels, haven't we? But he sends the man to this hill just outside the kind of southeast side of Jerusalem, and says, "Go and wash in this particular pool." And there's some depth to even the location of sending the man here, isn't there?
Yeah, and of course there is a significance to this pool. I mean, obviously, I think what's really striking is that Jesus, and again, there's a bit, I don't know if it's humor, but certainly there's a little bit of, oh, that's interesting. I don't know how you describe this, but Jesus sending a blind man somewhere to wash. So Jesus clearly has a confidence in this man that he knows how his way to find his way around this city and get to where he needs to go. But what some of our listeners may be aware of course, is that pool is the same pool that a Levite would be sent to on the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, sent with this golden pitcher to gather these waters. And of course, Jesus has already alluded to this in John 7, where he stands up and said, "If anyone's thirsty on the last great day of the feast, if you're thirsty, come to me and drink." So we've already seen a Johannine connection to this pool in John chapter 7, where Jesus has described himself as the one who can satisfy the thirst of humanity. And here he is sending sending this man to the same pool to wash in order to have his, not just his thirst quenched, but his eyes opened. So there is a beautiful little connection there. Don't know if you saw anything else in that, David.
I mean, this pool of Siloam or Shiloh, as it sort of seems in the Hebrew, it's a very interesting little piece, and even the language. There's a reference in the Hebrew to Shiloh in Genesis chapter 49, which there's some people that seem to think it has messianic resonances to it. So Jesus sending him to a place which has a subtle messianic name. John's kind of interesting here because he offers this translation that the word means sent, and that to me is really interesting because the Greek word is translated apostello, where we get the word apostle from.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really interesting that this man is given. I can't help it when John ever gives you a word in its Hebrew original, or he always then offers a translation, and there's often significance to him saying, I want you to pay attention to this. So if I pay attention to it, it's really interesting that this man is almost given some sort of apostolic commission. And then the next time we see this man, he appears to have done a lot of theological reflection on his walk to one side of the city and back, because he comes back, he still doesn't know who Jesus is, because they ask him, don't they? They say to him, well, who is he? And he's, well, where is he? And he's like, I don't know, right? But he's able to put the pieces together, and as a result, he becomes a defender of Jesus. He becomes someone who is witnessing to this Messiah. So by the end, he almost appears, if I could say, like an apostle. Right? Yeah,
he's certainly profoundly evangelistic, isn't he? I mean, without giving the end of our story away, which we'll lean into next episode, he clearly defends Jesus in the most powerful way, and the clarity of his defense, the confidence of that defense, is really, I found his language stunning, where he defends Jesus in just the most remarkable way. I'm just literally trying to find a little passage here, David, because it's so beautiful. Let me just remind our listeners of this. And he says, they sort of hurled insults at him and said, "We are disciples of Moses." And again, that contrast in the prologue, the law comes from Moses, grace and truth through Jesus Christ. And we don't even know where this man comes from. And his answer is just simply remarkable. He says, now that is remarkable. He says, you don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to a godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Now, I mean, he hasn't quite connected the dots that Jesus is 100% Messiah, because he's framed him in terms of prophet here and a good man, and it's that clincher conversation at the end of the story that seems to pull this right. But you know, this incredible statement: if he were not from God, he could not do these things. So there's a confidence, an evangelistic passion in this man, and that sort of lovely link to sentness and then returning with a passion, an evangelistic passion about the one who healed him, even though at this stage he doesn't fully understand everything about that person. And I can't help but hear an echo of our friend Legion. I know it's not his name, but it's the only name we've got. When we looked at him in Mark 5, David, who wants to get in the boat with Jesus, and Jesus says, no, you just stay here, go home and tell your family everything the Lord has done for you. And this man just goes back and tells everybody what happened to him and what he saw. And out of what he saw, what he experienced, what he felt, and what he knew about Jesus, a whole community of believers is built. And you see the same thing happening here. This man is now becoming a mouthpiece for Jesus before he's even fully aware of who Jesus is. And it shows then the power of the transformation that is going on in this man's world. He was blind, now he sees. The hint that, okay, that was a physical transformation, but clearly now a spiritual transformation is taking place. This man who was blind spiritually is now beginning to see something spiritually that will transform his world forever.
Well, I love that, John. And let's just pause that conversation then right here, and we'll come back to this story of the man who was born blind in the next episode. Okay, so that's it for the first episode this week. Our second part for this week will release on Thursday. If you want to get in touch with either of us about something we said, you can reach out on podcast@twotext.com or by liking and following the Two Text podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Don't forget that you can listen to all of our podcasts at www.twotext.com or wherever you get your podcasts from. But that is it for today. We're back on Thursday, but until then, goodbye.